everyone. Oh, that's a good choral response. Let's try that again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That's better. You're awake. Thank you for being here. I have the distinct pleasure this morning of introducing a wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Susan B. Neuman. We've had the pleasure of working together through a good part of our career, and it's been really great to get to know her and to have opportunity to work with her. Dr. Neuman is a specialist in early literacy development whose research and teaching interests include early childhood policy, curriculum, and early reading instruction for children who live in poverty. Her role as the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education. In that role, she established the Early Reading First program, developed the Early Childhood Educator Professional Development Program, and was responsible for all activities in Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Act. Dr. Neuman has written more than 100 articles, most of which are in top-tier research journals, and authored and edited 11 books, including the three-volume set of the Handbook of Early Literacy Research, published by Guilford Press in New York. She's authored a book called Changing the Odds for Children at Risk, Teachers College Columbia Press, Multimedia and Literacy Development with Taylor and Francis, and Educating the Other American. She is, her most recent book, which I really like, it kind of wows you if you know the acronym, World of Words, Vocabulary in the Common Core Classroom, or Increasing Vocabulary in the Common Core Classroom, pre-K through 2, and it is also published by Columbia University. She received her doctorate from the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. She's the department head in the Steinhardt School of Education at New York University currently, and she is an elected member of the International Reading Hall of Fame. If that isn't enough for you to want to hear from her, I don't know what I could say. She is a wonderful, wonderful, energetic person and has so much to share with you. I hope you'll give her a warm Wyoming welcome.
I have to say that I was traveling, and I came back to the United States, and of course the border person asked you, well, where are you from? And I said, I'm from the city. And he looked at me. I was coming into the United States, and of course I recognized that. Do you know what I was talking about? The city? New York. New York, exactly. So I'm from the city, and I get off the plane yesterday afternoon, and I said, wait a second, I have never seen anything like this before. It is so unbelievably beautiful. They're mountains, you have trees. I mean, like, I saw a tree losing its leaves once, but that's it. You know what I mean? And grass. It was remarkable. So I want to thank you for being here. I just love the beautiful vista, and I just couldn't get my eyes off of it. I got up early this morning because I'm on East Coast time, 4 o'clock in the morning, and just went outside, and it was just so unbelievably stunning. So. Just remember that there is another way of life and appreciate what you have here. So what I wanted to do today is I wanted to focus on learning from what works, helping all children become successful literacy learners. And one of the things that I noted, and I thought the superintendent's point was so well said, is that I'm going to show you today pictures of the work that I do with students. And I know some of you may be middle school and high school teachers, but part of the reason I want to show you these pictures is I love them. I just love them. I love looking at these children. I love being with these children. And so part of me is just happy to be here and share these beautiful children with you. I want to say that When we begin, I want to just be perfectly honest with you and say, I know you had a wonderful talk yesterday from Claude Goldenberg, and he's just fantastic. He has this wonderful language capability. He can go between Spanish and English very, very easily. He is charismatically working with children, mostly Spanish-speaking children. And I want to start by saying that that's not who you're getting this morning. It's not. So I'm a monolinguistic learner. That means I have one language. How many of you are with me here? Okay, so I'm not totally the minority, but I know people who are very interested in English language learning often have two languages. But in my case, I don't. I speak one language, I speak English, and I am not proud of it. It's not something I want to tout, but it is a fact. And I also want to do good for these children. When I say that I love them, I mean it. I go into the class, I fall in love every single time. And so I want to do my best for the children, but I have limits. Notice, I have real limits. In other words, I don't speak their language. And I don't speak it, I can't even do any kind of translanguaging, really, with these children. So I wonder how many of you are with me here? I took 4 years of French. Got A's all over. Every single time I got an A. And so listen to me. Bonjour, comment allez-vous? And if you answered me, I cannot answer you back. Because despite the fact that I have 4 years of language, I'm just not, it just doesn't grab for me. And so I want to tell you a dirty little secret. Lots of times when I send notes to parents, and I send notes in Chinese or Spanish, I have to use Google Translate. Do some of you do that? Tell the truth. And I can tell you, I don't know whether or not those letters that are going home are accurate or not. I'm just trying to do my best. I know it's important to speak and have parents understand what we're doing in schools. But at the same time, I don't have people who can translate for me. And so therefore, I'm trying to do my best. And I know these wonderful families will often smile and look at those letters and say, oh my gosh, what is she saying? But I'm trying. I'm trying. And the reason I bring up my own limitations is something very important. I am the teacher workforce. Let's admit it, that most of the teachers in the United States, we will increasingly have children who are second language learners, and yet we will not necessarily have the skills that we will need to work with these children. Furthermore, we won't have very many professional development opportunities, and many of our schools will not do enough to help our English language learners. One of the things we found when we looked at our students at New York University, and we felt very proud of what they do, they would say, I've learned a lot, but I don't know enough about English language learners. And it's almost as if we can't learn enough, because there are so many complications and so many things we need to understand. So what I wanted to talk today is I wanted to talk to you today about what we have done and what I've done particularly in New York City to focus on these children, to be successful with these children with my limitations, with the knowledge that I know I'm not good enough. And I told myself after this presentation, I'm going to take a Spanish class. So what do I know about the research? I know that translanguaging is very important. So for example, we now know that children aren't ELL or not, right? We know that they blend, and there's a lot of translanguaging going on. Children are going to use Spanish, Chinese sometimes when they talk and use English. So again, my limitation is I know a little bit about another language. I know that, sometimes I'm wearing a schmata. And I know that someone who drives me crazy is driving me mashugana. And I know that he's really if I talk about Ray, he's a mensch, right? He's a mensch. But frankly, those words that are in Yiddish are not particularly helpful for my language learners. In other words, I may trans-language, but that trans-languaging doesn't do really anything for these children, right? The second thing I know is that bilingual programs are really powerful. How many of you have them? That's just about as many as we have them in New York. One of the things we know is that bilingual programs are ideal. We can have children in English and another language. But the fact of the matter is that very often, at least in my area, there's mobility. And so children will have 1 year, maybe 2 years of a bilingual program and never have it again. And so one of the things that we know is the benefits that children might have in those programs are lost very often when they don't have a sustained program. And often they will not get sustained program. I want to tell you what is first cut when we see some of our cuts in budget, and it's those bilingual programs. I also know that sheltered programs are really good. In other words, we're teaching content. And we're trying to teach content and also teach language at the same time and help our students who are English language learners adapt using both the content and the language. And yet we don't have any of those either. And so we can say that these are in the research and these are very important. But what do you do when you have restricted budgets, when you have children who need these kinds of skills and you don't have those programs? How many of you are in that situation? Quite a few. So what is my solution? What is the solution we have to do? And my solution today is that we have got to provide these children with extremely rich language and literacy environment at the same time we work on a content-rich curriculum. Because if we're focusing only on language, then what will happen is that the children will miss the content that they so desperately need. So you and I have to figure out strategies that engage children in the language simultaneously while they're learning the rich content that they will need. So one of the things that we know is there's troubling results. And what we've seen is the National Assessment of Educational Progress just came out. It came out about last week, the date we call it, 2017. And what we know is that the results are absolutely flat. We have not seen any appreciable gain for our children. So I use that today as a call for urgency. We have an urgent problem. For example, our black students are still 30 points behind our white students in grade 4. Our Hispanic children and children of second language are also 30 points below in average scores. So we are not doing enough. We are not doing enough to enable them to be successful. And then some of the things that we also know is that once they're behind, they will stay behind. So it's very hard for these children to begin to catch up once they have fallen behind. Now, I don't want to make you depressed on a Saturday. It's too beautiful out. But these are things that we need to take very seriously because these children are not thriving. They are not thriving, and they need to. What do we know, and some more troubling statistics? We have a growing population of second language learners. In 1979, we only had 6 million. Now we have close to 14 million. We also know that the largest numbers of language learners are Spanish speakers, but there are many different languages and dialects. So in other words, when I'm in a class and I have a Spanish speaker and I have another Spanish speaker, they could not be able to communicate with one another because of dialectical issues. So in other words, it might look the same, but it's not the same, and the communication is very difficult. Many of our English language learners also suffer from other disabilities. For example, in New York, our children who come from Hispanic homes live in New York City, and you know enough about New York to know it's expensive. $25,000 and below for a family of 4. So many of our children are grappling with poverty, tremendous poverty, and food instability. Can you believe it in this country? Food instability, and they also will have language issues. So in other words, they may not be proficient in their first language and have difficulty with their second. So what we're seeing is a confluence of factors that may have difficulty when they are trying to succeed. And then this is even the worst statistic, at least for me. As many as 31 to 51% of these children will not graduate high school. And so it will continue the cycle of poverty. I'm not done, unfortunately. In addition, American schools, and I don't know, I'd love to hear your reaction, but I think that while we tout that bilingualism is good, I don't think we're sending that message really. I think what we're sending is a message that we expect children to transition to English. Do you agree?
Yes.
That if we say that bilingualism is good, but what we're actually doing is very often having that child lose their first language. And they are not necessarily appreciating the benefits of bilingualism. So, you know, Lisa Delpit, my colleague, talks about the culture of power. And the culture of power in the United States, at least now, is that English predominates. And so while we can argue that bilingualism is very, very important, we still prize American and standard English even at that. Secondly, children's bilingual education has often lacked, the language necessary to be bilingual, yeah. And then teachers often lack this training for children in pedagogical supports. And so one of the things that I'm going to turn to today is what are those pedagogical supports that can really enable students to learn. I want to enter, again, I'm showing you my beautiful children. We have a large project with thousands of children, because you know our population. You might have 12,000 here in Jackson, right? We have 12,000 in the school. No, I'm kidding. But we have very, very large numbers in New York. And I wanted to show you this beautiful picture for a moment. And I want you to ponder it. What do you notice when you look at it? If you look at many of our schools, they are not bilingual. There is not a bilingualism. There is a multilingualism. So in other words, in this beautiful picture, we have a child from Africa. We have a child from Spain. We have a child from Mexico. We have a child from Puerto Rico. We have a child from Haiti. And so many of us are dealing with multilingualism, which means that we cannot just privilege one language. Now, I'd love to hear what the languages are here in Wyoming. Is it Spanish? Raise your hand. Spanish? Is it Chinese? Yes, it's Chinese. Is it, what are some, oh, we have so many different languages. Is it language from Middle Eastern countries? A fair amount. So one of the things that we'll see is here is a teacher working with children. The other thing I wanted to show you is look at those hands. engagement, engagement. So these children, my children, and that's the way I see it, have enormous strengths, and you know it. They come to us, we've seen some of the problems, but we also know they come to us with beautiful and wonderful and enormous strength. Strengths that I wish I had. One of the things we know is they have greater cognitive flexibility. So did you notice that when we were doing that exercise before, you had to really think, didn't you? You had to think about those N's and those T's. And you had to develop a greater flexibility. And I'll tell you what Ray and I began to do. We began to do, okay, good. Okay, yes. In other words, we shorten our sentences dramatically. But one of the things you'll see is cognitive flexibility. These children are able to go back and forth in a way that will enhance so much learning later on. They also have greater executive functioning skills. In other words, many of these children can inhibit their control. In other words, they can get into a language and actually inhibit some of these outside executive functioning skills. They also have cognitive multitasking. So you'll see that they may act as a protective factor all the time in some of their work. And finally, fully bilingual Hispanics make more money. So many of you, if you have another language, you know how it could be an asset. And you know how many of us who train teachers, if they have more than one language, they're likely to be the first on the block to get the job, right? So the children bring these wonderful strengths of bilingualism or multilingualism. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about what the research is recommending to us and what we should begin to do. This is from 2 IES studies, practice guide, the Institute of Education Sciences. And it tells us evidence-based practices that we should see and do, right? So let me go through the first one. Look at this. We should screen children for reading difficulties. Do we really need to screen children for reading difficulties? What do you think? Yes? No? Want to think about it? Yes? But the fact of the matter is many of us know that they have problems, right? Screen them. Well, that's good. In other words, I know that I can have a child. One of the things we do is we ask teachers to comment on the children's verbal ability, and we can see in a moment that we don't need to screen, we can see it. Recommend intensive small group instruction. Well, this is great, but in many of our classes we have one teacher and 25 children. It's very, very hard to do all that flexible grouping. And the third recommendation says provide extensive and varied vocabulary instruction. Well, that's great, but in what language? And how do we begin to do that? Where are the specifics in terms of vocabulary interventions? And finally, integrate reading and writing in our teaching. Well, we already do that. So from my perspective as a monolingual adult, these are not very useful to me because I do some of these already, but they never got me into the weeds enough. In other words, how do I begin to do it? What do I begin to do? How does it look like? What does it look like when I actually go about teaching? And so, you know what we began to do? We began to do hit and miss. And we started to focus on strategies. And what kind of strategies are essential for working with our second language learners? What are the practices that make a difference? And one of the things I want to say is this is not about either preschool or secondary school. It's about even when you work with adults. So these are the research, and by the way, it's all on our website, so you're welcome to not take notes, not take pictures, but just, let's talk. So the first thing we know is we have to create a language-rich environment. How do very young children learn words? If we think about it, let's take ourselves and make us a baby again. Let's think about how we began to learn words. And one of the things that we began to do is we began to listen very closely. So if I am a mama and I'm talking to my child, I'm going to say, blah, 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 blah. And the child will look back at me, right? And the child will say, Mama, Mama. And of course, neither of us really understand each other as well. But what are the children getting at that moment? What are they getting at that moment? Blah, blah, blah. They're getting the tones of our language. They're getting and hearing what I'm saying. They're getting an effort to make contact with one another. And even though we're not understanding each other, we are at some level, aren't we? I know we are. Because I know when I used to send my little preschooler to play with a child who spoke a different language, they would say essentially, blah, 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 and they'd have a great time playing together. So at some level, at the very, very initial level, we're using immersion, aren't we? And then all of a sudden we're doing this. Oh, there's a doggy, there's a doggy. And the child will say, Papa. And what does the mother say? Oh, that's right, honey, it's a doggy. So what I do is I translate that child's sounds and I use those approximations. Now, the reason I'm saying that, and this is so critically important, is that you can only do that if you know children. One of the things that we underestimate is this word, is a fancy-dancy word called intersubjectivity. But the reason mothers and fathers are so capable at teaching children language is they know their child's intent. So I remember my child saying, I am very angry. And I remember him saying that to the preschool teacher, and she thought he meant, I am very hungry. And so she kept feeding him. And the kid would get angrier and angrier and say, I am very angry. Oh, you want some more food? Great, I'll give you more food. So my point is, when I heard him, I am very angry, and you know that's very true, I knew he was very angry. And the poor guy, he's now 35, but he still says angry because I thought it was so cute. But my point is, a sense of intersubjectivity means, it goes back to what the superintendent was saying before, you've got to know the children. You've got to know the children really well. And so when Aunt Betty or Aunt Lucia is ill for various reasons, you as teacher have to know that because it's a way of establishing intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity means that we are communicating with the child. So I want to give you another example. I'm going to work, and I'm in a hurry, all of us are. And I see someone in the hall, and I say, hi, how are you? I want you to think for a moment. Hi, how are you? Am I really interested in how that person is? See, in Wyoming, you're too nice. But in New York, nah, we're not interested. We're just being polite in our way. And so we say, hi, how are you? And we move on, don't we? Because we're not really interested, let's be honest. But what if I said, hi, how are you? And I looked into the eye of that adult, and I stopped. Do you know what would happen? that adult would then respond to me and say, oh, you know, not so good. And then, of course, what I would do is, well, tell me about it. So my point is, there's a time when teachers talk and they don't really mean it. And then there's a time they talk and they do want to communicate. And what we need to do is move toward that more in-depth talk. The second thing we know is conversational turns matter. So in other words, remember how before we were interacting, and what Ray and I began to do is shorter and shorter turns. But that turn made the interaction more and more active. So active processing occurs with that conversational turn. So what does that mean for you as teacher? Stop talking and engage the child in more listening and more interacting. So shorter sentences, more pauses in those sentences, allowing the children to respond back and respond back a lot. And that's a beautiful picture for my children, is that because I'm a teacher with them and I'm working with them, I can't always talk to them one-on-one, so I've got to create small groupings with children talking together. We also know that our children are, even at the high school level, going to need some of these things. One of the things is slow down and pacing. So in other words, I don't want people talking to me as if I'm a jerk. So, how are you today? No, I don't talk that way to children. But what I do want is I want more prosody, and I want a slower pace. So a lot of us pride ourselves in talking very fast. Slow down the pacing. And also these children will need phonological activities. So one of the things I do is a lot of singing. Supercalifragilistic expialidocious. So what I need children to do is to begin to hear the sounds of our language. Now, even in the middle and high school, one of the things we know is that singing really matters. Singing is very tonal. Children will begin to hear those sounds. And when I say to you, they also become a mnemonic device. If I say conjunction, junction, even though Bill Cosby, we don't like him so much anymore, we still remember his song. And conjunction, junction, what's your function? You remember it. So phonological activities are really important for these children because they need to hear the individual sounds. For middle and high school, what we do is we focus on morphological units, larger units, so that children can hear the sound. The other thing that we do, and you may hate this, but we do it a lot and it works. We use call and response. Have you ever heard these techniques? A little bit? So today we're going to focus on a cat and a dog are both pets. What are a cat and dog? Pets. A cat and dog are both pets. A cat is a pet, that's right. A cat is a pet. A dog is a pet. A dog is a pet, that's right. A cat and a dog are pets. What are they? Pets. So what did you just do when I interacted like this back and forth? You're actively responding. And you're responding in very brief ways, but it's extraordinarily powerful. Because what children will do is, do you notice how many times I repeated things? You didn't need a workbook, you didn't need a word page, but I'm doing it a lot. And the call and response actively engages these children, because many of them will choose to be silent. And then buddy talk, of course, and comprehensible input. But this is hard to begin to do. So these are the 10 strategies that we have found are highly research-based. I'm going to talk just about a few of them, but I wanted to give you an overview of exactly what they are. The first thing children will need, and adults at all levels, even if you're teaching adults, is visual. They need visuals. They need to actually see things as you're talking about them. The context in the picture matters tremendously. And there's a tremendous amount of research that talks about the power of pictures. 2, they'll need those mnemonic devices. So we do a lot of, I'm in preschool through grade 2, but we'll do a lot of singing, and we'll do a lot of predictable text where we create mnemonic devices. And we'll do a lot of repetitions in that mnemonic device. So in other words, if I say brown bear, what do you see? There's some early childhood people here. I can hear it. You're quiet. We're noisy. But I see a green frog looking at me. Green frog, green frog. Do you hear all the repetitions I'm doing? But also, do you notice that I'm now an adult and I'm still recalling that darn book? Right? So, mnemonic devices really, really matter. 3rd is a check for understanding and progress monitoring. So many of you probably have heard progress monitoring. I'll show you how we do it. One of the things I worry about, we have terrible situations here in New York, but one of the things that we've had is testingitis. Do you know what that is? You know what testingitis is? Yeah. You have one test, then another, then another, then another, and another. But what we'll do, so I'm very nervous about testing at this point because I like instruction. So we do progress monitoring in a very informal way, but what we have to do is we have to measure whether we are teaching and successfully teaching. And then what we do is think time. You've heard about wait time, right? We'll give them 3 additional seconds for children to respond. And then we always, I can't see what this is. We use lots of hand signals. Hand signals, and you're going to see them in a little bit. And gesturing. Heterogeneous grouping, which we talked a little bit before. We're going to repeat, but I'm going to show you how we do it. Multiple modes of presentation, where we provide children with different ways to learn things. And explicit instruction. And finally, this last one is building bridges to understanding. So those are 10 research-based principles that we're going to use throughout our instruction. Now, I'm going to show you some examples. And I may even, I don't know where we can hear one of those examples, but I can try. I'm going to show you those examples in the context of the programs in which we work with children. And again, if you're someone other than preschool through grade 2, what you need to do is take these principles and then apply them in your own setting. The first is explicit instruction. Now, explicit instruction is really important. And what do I mean by it? I can't tell you how many times I go into a setting and the teacher is saying to the children, what do you think the book is about? What's wrong with that? Tell me what's wrong. I have to see where I am. What's this book about? I'm going to give you think time. The problem is, if they knew what the book was about, they wouldn't have to come to school. And guess who's going to answer that question? Guess. The kids that know. So you get this. And if I can show you a video in a second, I'll show you. Right? What's annoying about that? How can I do think time when a kid is waving and I'm feeling so absolutely dumb? So my point in saying is we never do that. We never never will ask a question like that. We'll say, today, boys and girls, the book is about caves. A cave is like a hole in the mountain. So in other words, I give them short, child-friendly kinds of definitions that get them in the book. Now, what am I doing in that very moment? I'm creating a shared understanding. So, you know, your superintendent was saying she's an introvert, and believe it or not, so was I. Not any longer. I remember the teacher asking me a question, and I bit my nails at the time. And I said, if I bite them, if I look really neurotic, she'll never pick up. And, right? So I would sit there like this. And I had the situation of the superintendent that she described, and I got up and I cried. I did. So in other words, what I'm doing is I'm creating a joint understanding for everyone. And then I say to the children, here are some vocabulary words we will see in a reading. So one of the things is I give them the information to use as we're about to work. Do you see how different that is? We've heard a lot about dialogic reading, and do you know what we say? Stop dialoging. Stop it. Because a lot of our children don't know how to answer those questions, and we're losing the flavor and the beauty of the book. So if I say, chicka, chicka, boom, boom, will there be enough room? And the teacher says, let me stop and ask you a question. What is chicka, chicka, boom, boom? Do you know what I mean? How it stops the whole rhythm and the sound of the book? So we want to see explicit instruction. Second, we want to see children make comparisons and contrasts. Remember I said that here are children who are doing a lot of work. All of our children are second language learners, but notice how she's using picture supports in that work. She is differentiating between and trying to come up with some schema on what is a farm animal. And so what she's doing a lot of pointing because she doesn't know the words quite yet. But notice the good cognitive work that she's doing with children. So one of the things that we do, and I'm encouraging you to think about, is we focus on categorical learning. How are things alike and how are things different? So do you remember when you used to watch Sesame Street, which one doesn't belong? Right? We do that a lot. And the reason that is it's taking all those words for children and it's putting them in categories that they can remember and become mnemonic devices. Categories have what we call inductive potential. And what I mean by inductive potential is they help us presume and develop inferences so that they can understand. If I say a horse and a pig are both farm animals, and then I say to the children, what is a, oops, I'm getting out my area of expertise here, a hen. And I say a hen is a farm animal. What do I know about it? So it has inductive potential, and it's a key to really understanding comprehension and knowledge networks. So I'm going to show you other ways in which we begin to do that and actually concretize it more deliberately. But again, focus on the issue that we're using a great deal of pictures in our support. Again, this is not kids raising their hands. This is signaling. So we do a lot of signaling because notice, do you see our beautiful kids? I don't know if I can do any pointing, but do you see that they come from so many different settings and so many different places? And then what we do here is this is another example. Again, we have preschool through K, but this is another example of how are they all alike? How are they all different? So one of the things that we often do is we often take vocabulary words from the books that we're actually reading. Instead, what we try to do is we try to really build categories through bingo, through matching games, through interesting kinds of activities. Notice, again, that the gesturing is very important. We also use multimedia. And what I mean by that is we have either, these are old televisions, but we also have iPads in some of our schools, and we often give them multimedia examples. So we have rich research that tells us about dual coding theory. And let me just take a second to talk about what I mean by dual coding. With dual coding, the children are learning the visual and the oral separately. So if I am talking to you, and I also have music going on, what do you find? I'm talking to you, and there's background music. What happens? Do you get distracted? A little bit, right? Or how about going, last night I went to a really noisy restaurant. What happens? A lot of conflict, right? That you hear, but you don't hear. And there's a lot of going on. What dual coding is arguing is we need to focus on the oral language, no music, and visual. And the visual actually enables our children to match the oral and the visual together. So dual coding is learning from two channels rather than one. And what happens is that children begin to understand and develop a more robust sense of learning. Think time. As I said, take 3 seconds more and pause. And look at those children's eyes. So this is one of my favorite pictures. And I'll tell you what we did. And again, I work with pre-K through grade 2. And this happens to be a kindergarten classroom. And we did something magical. I know you're not going to think maybe it's magical. But notice where the teacher is sitting. You see? See anything cool? All right, what's cool here is we got the teacher off her rocking chair. Why is that important? Because when she's down with the children, working with the children, notice the eye-to-eye instruction. Notice that the child and the teachers are now closely interacting. Now, the reason I talk about that is positionality matters. In other words, when I'm with those children and they can see my eyes, they may not be able to see all the words and hear all the words or understand all the words. But the communication pattern is so much more dramatic when you're on the same plane with the children. And so we want to see that joint attention for our kids. We want to see that the teacher is really paying attention to our children. We had a wonderful example one time of joint attention. And we were focusing, I went to a classroom of a magical teacher, and she had planned this wonderful experience. The bird that she had, or the chicken she had, was about to lay an egg. Whew, big stuff, right? And then, as she was about to introduce the lesson in an eye-to-eye kind of instruction, one child raised her hand and said, "I lost my tooth last night." I don't know about you and if you're young mothers or fathers, but losing a tooth is like a big deal, a big deal. And so that wonderful teacher in her eye-to-eye instructions said, what? Not oh honey, now we're going to talk about the chicken laying the egg, she talked about, oh really? Tell me about it. And so the ability to change the conversation and to move it into what children are really interested to happens during eye-to-eye instruction. This is another, have you fallen in love yet? No, have you fallen in love yet? Because you should. These children are my children, and these are the children I work with. And as you are hopefully seeing, the nationalities vary as the pictures are shown. But one of the things that we often miss is that our second language learners are learning, but we don't see it. Have you ever experienced that? In other words, people will talk about the silent period, the period where they don't seem to interact, but oh my gosh, they're learning leaps and bounds. And we can't see it, but it's happening. And so in this new law, in the ESSA, the federal law, what has become instantiated much more is this concept called Universal Principles of Design. Have you heard about it before? Yay. Some of the special ed people who are familiar with universal design features might know about. But what this says to us is an important feature for our second language learning. And that is, lots of times they know, but they can't say it. So what we do is we say any kind of representation is good. What we want you to do is represent your ideas in a way that you can communicate. So what we do is we often ask students to draw it, we can write it, we can represent it in some way, or we can perform it in even some kind of play and reader's theater. So this child is learning, what she's showing me is all about what she's just learned, the rainforest. And she's going to describe it in her own way. And the one on the left is, he's learned about, guess what? Insects. So this is his representation of insects, and it's actually very sophisticated, because if you knew a lot about insects, like some of my kids do, you'd know that they have 3 body parts. Is this remarkable? I was very proud. Repetition. Children will need at least 10 repetitions to get every 1 out of every 4 words. So in other words, you and I are often not repeating things enough. We need many, many repetitions for the children to learn. So what we do is we focus on partial learning, and we focus on the words that children will need in order to read and listen in multiple contexts. So one of the things I'd like to highlight here is that they will need to hear these words in different kinds of context. So if I just say insect, 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 it's not that the children are going to learn that. If I even say insect, call a response, it's not that the children will learn. They have to learn in very multiple contexts. And they have to learn with active processing. So I want to tell you how we get that repetition, because repetition can be boring, right? If I'm coming into the classroom and I'm saying egg, apple every single day, it gets rather repetitive. So the way in which we do it is we've established a program called the World of Words. And by the way, everything is free that I'm going to show you, so you can go to the website and download it. And I have our website right here. So one of the things that we came up with, which I know it doesn't sound like rocket science, but it actually is kind of rocket science-ish. And that is, we read to children every single day. We read to children every single day, regardless of whether we're pre-K all the way to high school. And what we'll do is, instead of picking a different book every single day, what we pick is a book on the same topic. Now Now I know that sounds, hey, so what's the big deal? But these text sets are very carefully curated. And what I mean by that is they're all on topics that are essential for children to learn, rich science concepts which children want to learn about. We also focus on math concepts. And what we do is, the reason we named the program WOW is we say we want kids coming to school. And instead of learning the rudiments or fundamentals of learning, we want them to come to school and say, wow, I'm going to learn words. We want to make them word conscious, aware of those words. So how do we actually do it? This is an interesting topic on, I think it's on marine mammals. Yeah, it's on marine animals. And what we do is we take a collection of books of different genre and vocabulary teaching sequences, and we teach them and work with them over a course of 3 weeks. So in other words, the children will hear these books, these same 5 books, for 3 weeks. Tell me why that's powerful. It's powerful because they're going to hear those words. We read to them 3 times a week in this scenario, and 3 times the second week, and then we have the 3rd week is sort of a refresher kind of week. But what happens is the words that they're going to hear here are same here, same here, same here, same here, in different contexts. In different contexts. So they're learning about genre at the same time they're learning about words. It's a collection that they will hear. Now, it's very easy to do. It's very easy to do. So let me just tell you the sequence that we use. We start with a predictable book. Why do we love predictable books? Predictable books. Brown bear, what do you see? Why do we like it? Because it's a mnemonic device. So in other words, when I use predictable books again and again, what children will do is they'll remember those words. So I start with a predictable book with not too much language in it. It will be very, very chicken soup. You know, eating once, eating twice, eating chicken soup with rice. So in other words, I'll start with a very predictable book. And by the way, I do this, I know you're not going to believe it, but I do this with adults. And I've taught adults English literacy through these kinds of books. So we'll always start with a predictable book, because not many words and highly memorable and mnemonic. We'll then go to a rhyming book, same topic. And what we'll do is we'll have words that rhyme. And they may not be quite as predictable. And then what we'll do is the 3rd book is we'll have a narrative. Because one of the things we know about books and storybook narratives is that children care and they love to care about those topics. And then finally, what we'll have is information books. And the reason we end up with information books is that the vocabulary is much harder. Much, much harder than the predictable book and the rhyming book. So I'm not sure if I can do this. Do you think you can play it? If not, I'll skip it, but yeah. Want to try it again?
So today's lesson, we are going to learn more about the tropical rainforest. Let's see what you remember so far. Why do you think it's called rainforest? Yes.
Because a lot of rain comes down.
A lot of rain comes down, yes. Why else?
There's a lot of animals.
There's a lot of animals, yes.
And there's a waterfall.
There could be a waterfall, Liam.
Notice that she's repeating.
And there's wild creatures.
wild creatures, yes.
bubble here.